Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Whitcomb, and in this presentation, we're going to be thinking about some ways that we can maximize our readers' engagement when it comes to strengthening the core. Obviously, reading engagement is essential, not just in a language arts classroom, but in every content area within education. And so I'm hoping that you are able to walk away with just a couple of ideas for how you can better engage your readers and hold them to a rigorous standard while still meeting them where they're at. So a little bit of background on me. I am a middle school English teacher. I've been teaching English for the last 8 years in Pike Township. And these strategies that I'm going to share with you today are things that I've come to discover actually work for me, especially if you're a new teacher. You will be inundated with ideas and strategies and trends and tricks for you to try out. And the fact of the matter is, you have to just figure out what works for you. Trial by error is a key way to figure out what works for you. So as you're listening today, jot down ideas of things that you think you might want to try, or as we get to the end, if you've got questions, I'm going to share my contact information so that we can maybe brainstorm together how these can better fit your classroom and your setting. But we've just all been a part of those PDs where theoretically, the idea sounds great. And then when rubber meets the road, it just feels like, was a teacher actually behind that idea or not? And it just doesn't quite pan out like they say it will. So this is not that. These strategies are battle tested, and they're things that I've come to really rely on and value when it comes to reading engagement in my own classroom. So that being said, the presentation is broken down into 4 key categories in which I think some simple changes can really benefit our students. But full disclosure, each one of these itself could be a week-long PD. There's just so much depth to each of these topics. So this is just a quick overview. I'm hoping to do more with Keep Indiana Learning more specifically, maybe on each of these categories down the road. But again, these are just some of my favorites that I'm going to highlight as we go through this today. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we can get started. By the way, I apologize for the vintage-esque filter. I turned my camera on and it was like that one day, and it's been like that ever since. I don't know how to change it. So anyways, here we go. Maximizing our readers' engagement with the emphasis of strengthening our core. So before we start, I want you to think about in your own life, what about teaching reading and writing excites you? Maybe you're not an English teacher per se, but you have reading and writing in your classroom. So even if you've never thought about it before, what about that is something that you could be passionate about? What about teaching reading and writing is something that, as it says here, excites you and kind of puts a little oomph in your step? I'm just going to pause and give you a minute to think about that before I share with you my answer. So for me, teaching reading and writing is exciting. It's honestly kind of thrilling because of the power of words. It's amazing to me how 26 letters can be arranged in an infinite number of arrangements in order to communicate thoughts and ideas. And that's what's so exciting about the power of language. And it's not just the English language, but any language is the gift to communicate and to express ideas. And when you think about the centuries of civilizations that have been able to do just that, express feelings, share ideas, open their perspectives, hear what one another has to say, engage in discourse and debate in order to sharpen themselves, that's what's so exciting to me. And I don't want students to be to go on to the next grade level without knowing what I'm passionate about in regards to reading and writing. And students pick up on your passion, even 8th grade middle schoolers who I could make an argument are the most checked out individuals, K through 12, other than maybe spring semester seniors. Even to 8th graders, they can get some energy from you when you're passionate about what you're teaching. So if you think about reading and writing in that kind of way, again, even if you're not an English teacher, that will move on to your students. They will pick up on that passion. And it might just be enough to get one student. All of these strategies, you might just get one with each of them. But if you get 30 more, how much you have gained from trying these strategies. So think about that as we go, because that's going to kind of be a recurring theme. This passion of the written and spoken and heard word. All right, so the 4 categories in which I broke this down into our culture, creating a reading culture, thinking about intentional planning with the idea of engaging reading down the road, instructional practices, and lastly, feedback that we give to our students. So first up, thinking about a reading culture. These are some different ways that you can pump up or excite your readers. When you have a thriving reading culture, students are excited about reading. Now, I always start off my year telling my students that you will never love everything you read. No one on the planet loves every single thing that they have ever read. And that's okay. And it's a misconception to think that you love reading. If you love reading, you love everything. And if you don't love everything you've read, then you must hate reading. In our day and age where students' reading stamina is very low, imaginations aren't as tapped into as they once were, in my opinion, thanks to social media and, the entertainment industry with movies and TV shows. But I digress. In such a world, we have to get our students excited, and we have to help them understand that there is something you will like to read, whether it's a graphic novel or nonfiction or sci-fi or poetry. There is something that you will enjoy reading, and the trick is to find it. So the first strategy, and this is my most favorite, is having a read aloud novel. A read aloud novel is not in front of the kids. They're not following along with their own copy. It's simply a novel that you are reading out loud to your students as time allows, every couple of days, reading a chapter or two. Read alouds allow for students to hear how a story is supposed to be read with a teacher whose reading fluency is much stronger than your students. And it also just taps into students' imaginations. I turn off the lights in my room. I tell my kids, put your head down and try to picture what's happening in the story. And also, it's oftentimes one of the few times a student will last through a whole entire novel is if you're reading it to them. And so there's a lot of value in these read alouds. A couple of things to think about as you're choosing your read aloud novel. You obviously want something that you can finish in the whole year. You want something that has short chapters so that you can just, as time permits, read a chapter or two here and there. And my personal favorite is a book called The False Prince. It's one that I have read to my students over 8 years. I've probably read it 30 times. And the last thing that you need or characteristic of your read aloud book should be something that doesn't get boring to you. If you're tired of reading the same thing 6 times a day, if you have a middle school English class and you've got 6 periods, if you're tired of reading it by 8th period, that's going to be reflected in your voice. And then it's just going to lose just a little bit of the impact that it could have if it's something that you're like, oh man, this is so good. It never gets old. So the read aloud, that's the first thing. Book talks, kind of coupled with read alouds. Book talks are for you and your students to be able to have this discourse about novels, books that they have read. Book talks open the opportunity for students to speak with each other about books. And we all know middle school classroom, middle school students, they don't hear what the teacher has to say nearly as loudly as they hear what their peers have to say. So if you can get your students up and reading or talking about the books that they have read, that is a huge way to encourage their classmates to read as well. And as funds permit, if you are able to add to your own classroom library with the books that your students are recommending, that is huge. It makes your students feel like they are part of this classroom environment, they're investing, and that you're listening to them. And those things are huge in creating excited readers. The next thing is a literacy night. Now, a literacy night, the intention is that students and their families are exposed to literature or just reading skills, reading and writing skills in fun, interactive ways that maybe they've never really considered, oh, that's literacy before. And it's supposed to pump up the entire community of your school with this positive energy regarding reading. Lastly, if you can arrange an author's visit of some sort, whether it's via Zoom or in person, that is another amazing way to get your readers excited and locked in on whatever it is that you're trying to do. So for instance, as I mentioned, my favorite read aloud book is called The False Prince. And a couple years ago, the author, Jennifer Nielsen, agreed to meet with my students who were writing their own short stories and walk through the writing journey with them. And it was the most amazing experience. I'm not just saying that as a teacher, the kids were saying the same thing. Miss Nielsen was incredibly engaging, so credit to where credit is due, but it brought the book to life. And it also made the idea of being an author somewhat more tangible, because here they were, the kids, speaking with a real life author who made her living that way. And she showed us her inspiration in her office. And it just made that idea of being an author a little bit more concrete. It also can motivate your students to finish the book. If they know that the author of this book is coming at the end of the school year, that might be enough to get a couple more students engaged in whatever it is, whatever book it is that you're reading. So these are some ideas for increasing the reading culture in your building, talking about books, being excited about books, finding a book that every student can enjoy. And that doesn't have to be the same book for each student, but helping each student find something that they have enjoyed reading and create that positive interaction with the text. Another idea is to share the insights of others with your students. Why does reading and writing matter so much? What is the value of language? Which again is that question I asked you at the beginning. But here's some ideas of what other people have to say. Again, just reinforcing the teacher saying something is one thing, but other people's ideas all of a sudden seem to really matter to our students. So this first one, reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. That's the perfect quote for this conference, thinking about strengthening the core, strengthening your minds in a healthy way. Next, reading gives you someplace to go and you have to stay where you are. How many of our students feel trapped in the walls of their school and they just want an escape? Well, here's the thing. You're recognizing to them that they might feel trapped, and you're giving them their escape route when you give them a book that they can just get lost in. And that kind of is like, what? If you admit to students that they can't go anywhere and you know how that might feel, they kind of lighten up a little bit and they're willing to hear what you have to say next. The next one, today a reader, tomorrow a leader. If you give them context with who Margaret Fuller is, that's a very even more inspirational thought, that if you're reading today, you can lead tomorrow. And then lastly, kind of that same idea of giving you somewhere to go. That's important to students. They want the freedom, but also middle school or just adolescence in general is all about finding identity, finding your identity. So if you can help students see that reading can genuinely help them learn something about themselves, find a little bit more out about themselves, that's craved in adolescence, and that's a huge benefit of reading. And so if you can help them see that, you might get just one more on board with you. After you have been thinking about these different ways to build the reading culture, the next category is planning intentionally so that you can, again, maximize your readers' engagement as you go. So the first part of intentional planning with reader engagement in mind is simple, really. It's starting with the standards that your state has provided for you. This could be, like I said earlier, a whole session in and of itself, but we are going to take a look at how to take standards that are monstrous, they've got so much packed into them, and break them down standard by standard or portion or skill by skill, really, and then develop tasks, develop things for students to do that are achievable, but also hold them accountable for being engaged with whatever it is that you're reading. So using state standards for developing skills is so powerful, not only in the sense that it's preparing students for the standardized test, which is not what we are about, but it's just a happy byproduct of this process. But it also empowers you as the teacher. You understand your own content so much deeper. You're able to communicate with parents and administrators and colleagues why it is that you're doing what you're doing. And that's huge. That's really huge. So when it comes to the state standards, as I just mentioned, so many of them, not just in English standards, but science standards, social studies standards, they're huge, they're vast. There's so much packed into each standard. And that can be overwhelming. So taking it small, just taking a few bites here and there can really make the whole process a lot more, or feel a lot more manageable as you start off your year. Another part to that is thinking about how you can scaffold over the year. If the standard says something like analyze the development of the theme, which we're going to get to in a minute, you can't analyze if you haven't first identified the theme. You have to know what the theme is. And it's so easy for us to just kind of jump right in and not think about the foundation or the lack thereof of what our students are coming in the door with. And so it's important to think about, you don't have to master the standard in August. You have a whole year to get your students to mastery of standards. And if we just start with the whole entire piece from the beginning, we're going to burn out our students. We're going to burn out ourselves with how much work we're trying to put into it and the frustration of the results. And that's not fair to your students or to you. You have a whole year to get there. And that's what you need to be thinking about. How can you scaffold, take a step on the ladder across, like over the course of the whole year? With that idea of scaffolding, these standards are not one and done. No standard pretty much is one and done. You will constantly be revisiting these skills, whether it's a different genre of text, whether it's a different unit. It truly doesn't matter, because these skills just are so foundational that they just appear in every kind of reading engagement that your students might do, whether in an English classroom, social studies, math, it doesn't matter. Understanding the main idea of a math question is super important before you can actually do math. So constantly thinking about that if you don't get it this time, you're coming back to it. We're going to hit it again. And with that last piece there, constantly assessing in creative ways. You do not need to burden your students with more standardized testing. You don't need to burden them more with just cold text assessments. If you can constantly be assessing, even in conversation, where are my students at, having them address the class or small groups in different kinds of ways that can be engaging and sneaky, like they don't even realize that you're assessing them. That's huge, so that you know where to come back to when you revisit the skill again. Where do you need to start? Where do you need to reteach? What do you need to reteach? How do you build on to the foundation that you've already given them? Constantly reflecting and thinking about how to creatively get them to share information with you. So that's the first part. So we're going to take a look right now at a couple of standards. These are specifically 8th grade English standards. And think about how to break these down into so many different possible tasks that the standard just kind of presents. So this first one says, analyze the development of a theme or central idea over the course of a work of literature, including its relationship to the characters, setting, and plot. Provide a detailed summary that supports the analysis. Oh, that's so much. Okay, so what I want you to do is pause this video here just a minute and make a list of however many tasks you see that pop out of this standard. How many tasks could you see you asking your students to do that are connected to this standard? Make a list, push pause, and then when you've got your list done, come back, because we're going to go through the ones that I came up with here in just a second. All right, so this is the list that I came up with. First off, you have to be able to identify a theme. Secondly, before you can think about analyzing the development, you have to know what that even means. What are they asking you? So what techniques does the author employ? How do they develop the theme over the course of the story? Third, are the characters impacted by the theme, or how do the characters' actions allude to the theme? How does the setting help create the theme? Number 5, how do the events of the plot develop the theme? Like what is happening that's leading to this theme? Number 6, you have to understand the purpose of a summary and what a summary is before you can write one. And then you also have to know, like, what goes into this summary? What do I need to include in order to provide a detailed summary that supports the analysis of how the theme was developed? That's a lot. That is a lot of skills, and this is going to take time, especially at the beginning of the year when you're trying to put your finger on what your students are already mastered, and just where you're starting in relation to the standard. So with your planning, part of this is recognizing that it needs to happen in steps, right? You cannot just do it all at once. Recognizing that we can come back to these standards multiple times. So maybe the first quarter, you're thinking about identifying a theme and teaching that. And then the next quarter, it's not only identifying the theme, but it's also thinking about, how do the characters portray this theme? How do they relate to the theme? And then maybe the next time you're thinking about, oh, the setting, how does the setting? So you break it down over time, and that's a part of your planning. You need to be intentional in thinking about that so that you can engage your readers each step of the way and not lose their engagement by just being the dumping ground for the whole entire standard. Okay, so another one, also 8th grade literature, and it's very much tied to the first one, for standard. So it says, analyze how particular lines of dialogue or incidents in a work of literature propel the action, reveal aspects of a character, or provoke a decision. So for this one, same thing. I want you to think for a minute about all the possible tasks that could come with this standard right here. Push pause, make your list, and then when you're done, come back so that you can kind of compare your list to the one that I've created, which is not in any way, shape, or form an end-all be-all list, but we can just kind of compare notes. So here's what I came up with. First off, students have to be able to recognize dialogue. What is dialogue versus narration? You could also have a unit here or a lesson or two here about punctuating dialogue. Every language arts grade level or grade levels language arts standards have a standard that students are writing a narrative, and part of the narrative includes using dialogue. So this is a great place to kind of be thinking intentionally down the road. Okay, the goal ultimately is to write a narrative. Part of that is dialogue. So how can you use a text that you're currently reading to help start peeling back that onion of using dialogue well, correctly, and intentionally? So punctuating dialogue. Third, finding examples of the dialogue showing the reader something about the character, teaching something about the character. How do the conversations move along the plot? How does something someone says inspire someone else to go do something, or that last one, make a decision? How does someone's comment help someone else decide something? Those are the things that you're looking for. So the next part of this, I'm going to show you, this is a copy of my notebook. It's a picture of my personal notebook, which I have. Every reader in your classroom should have a central location where they're doing this engagement work. And we're going to get to that more down the road, but this is mine. And everything that I asked my students to do basically has been modeled in my notebook. So this is the first task that we did with this standard. So The Outsiders was the book we were reading. And we started off at the beginning of The Outsiders, just looking for different examples of when the dialogue exposed the characters. So before we even dove into that, I first had my students really focus on paraphrasing this standard. What are we being asked to do? You have to understand that before you can actually do it. So in this part where it says reveal aspects of a character, we went with exposing characters, lingo that the kids use, and they fully understand that. So we kept a list as we read. Students were also highlighting in their books, like the actual lines, you can see the page numbers there, and making comments like this revealed about soda pop. This one was about dairy. And as they're reading, they're actively looking for these things. And it's exciting because, hands are flying up all over the room with ideas of, oh, I just learned something about soda pop. Oh, I just learned something about dairy. And this is a great one to do at the beginning of the book when you're not as familiar with characters. So that's the first task that we tied to this standard. The next one, also tied to this standard and thinking about the narrative that they would write down the road. We had gone through different rules of punctuating dialogue. And so we looked for each of those rules as it played out in an actual story. Like, where do you see authors actually punctuating their dialogue in this kind of way? With speaker tags at the beginning, speaker tags at the end, speaker tags in the middle, those kinds of things. And you yourself, you are not the only model for your students. Should you be modeling pretty much everything you're asking them to do? 100%. But use the resources around you to also be a model. Real authors have to do these things. That's why you're learning this. Okay, it's not just arbitrary and we're trying to make you miserable. No, this is really at play here, and it helps your comprehension as a reader when you understand why it's being done this way. The next part of intentional planning, kind of moving away from the standards and thinking more about the text that you choose. How can the text you choose either inflate or deflate student engagement? Because that's what it will do. If you pick the wrong text, it can kill all progress almost immediately. So it's nothing that you should be doing, kind of on accident, but you should be really intentionally thinking about this. So some of the best advice or the best theory that I've ever heard is from fellow Buckeye from The Ohio State University, Dr. Bishop, Rudine Sims Bishop. And she presented this idea of literature acting as windows and mirrors. So if you've never heard this theory before, it's this idea, you can see the quote from her there, that if a book or literature is acting as a window, it's allowing students to see into a world that's not their own. They might know that world exists, they might be familiar with it, or it might be totally brand new to them, like, it's out in sci-fi, like futuristic, or it's in a country that they don't know much about. But it can allow them to see the world in a different kind of way, or actually just see the world. It allows you to see the world. Secondly, though, our literature should be working as a mirror in which it reflects our own lives and experiences back to us. And when I say our own lives, I mean the reader in general, not the teacher in the room. So teachers, this is our chance to really intentionally choose texts that we know are going to resonate with our kids because they see themselves in it. Middle schoolers, I keep coming back to middle school, really any child, any adolescent, any reader, they like to see themselves represented, but especially those in those adolescent years where reading seems like you're asking them to do the most boring or the hardest job on the planet and read this book. How can you make it more, how can you make it better for them? Well, choosing something that you know they're going to connect with is huge. And so those mirrors are really important. And before you can choose those texts, lots of times you have to know your students. So a couple of things to avoid when you're choosing texts. There's different theories on the value of textbooks, but in general, I would think about your textbook as a resource. It is not the end all be all. I know different districts have different policies, but you should not be pulling every single text you read just straight out of the textbook, because there is no textbook that's perfectly manicured for your student body. It can be great in a pinch. It can be great getting you like a very content specific, I need an argumentative speech, and it can provide those things. But the textbook should not be the end all be all. Also, while we all love our tried and true texts, and those are great sometimes, don't allow yourself to miss out on such a massive array of texts to choose from just because you found 5 that you love. Maybe use 2 or 3 of your tried and true, but then try to replace or at least circulate your other options with new texts to you, or maybe they're just fresh off the press. But don't just rely on those tried and true, because your student body changes and your own perspective gets kind of narrowed if you just stick to those 5. So constantly be challenging yourself to be on the lookout for new to you texts that apply here. They're both windows and mirrors to your students. Next, in your planning, you have to expect the unexpected. Teaching is exciting because it's never the same day to day, but part of responsible planning is thinking about what could go awry, what could kill our engagement, what could kill classroom management, and then cause us to miss a whole day of instruction because I just wasn't ready for it. And there's no way you will ever be able to plan for every possible interruption or unexpected event, but that should be going through your mind as you prepare, if nothing else, for your own sanity's sake. So some things that you might run into. Content misconceptions. You definitely need to be preparing for those. How could students misunderstand what is being asked of them, or what it is that they're reading? Being ready to clarify the concepts that you're teaching. Internet crashes in this day and age. What are you going to do if the internet crashes at school and the text you were going to read, dang it, is online? Be prepared for that, because that happens more often than we would like to admit. Poorly worded directions. You have to step outside of your own head for this one, but as you're creating the activities for your students to do, or using what other people have created who don't know your students, how could the wording of the directions be confusing and then kill the momentum that you had building in your classroom? Cultural context. What kinds of things do your students need to understand, whether it's because the text took place in a different time period, or because it reveals a different cultural group? I mentioned earlier that my students were reading not Nothing But the Truth, The Outsiders earlier this year. and we were reading about the fuzz, and they didn't know what the fuzz was. And it's easy for me to assume that they know what the fuzz is, because doesn't everybody know what the fuzz is, right? And so then in those moments, you're like, oh, well, that would be a definition that would be important to clarify. So thinking about those key terms, or those cultural pieces that might cause confusion, or students might think they know and then actually have a wrong idea. Forgotten supplies. This one is the bane of my existence, but what are you going to do when there's no Chromebook charger? What are you going to do when there's no pencil, or the book was left in their locker, or their notebook is at home? What are you going to do in those situations? Again, always with the intention of not allowing the momentum or the engagement to die because of these things happening. So we're always thinking about our readers' engagement. We always want to be prepared to help our students stay engaged and to hold them to it. You know, when in middle school, lots of times it's like, oh man, I left my notebook at home. And they're trying you. They're trying to see, are they going to get out of something? What are you going to do? And when you have an answer and you're ready to go, then their little scheme just kind of crashes and burns in front of them, and they have no choice. And that's what you want. You don't want them to be able to manipulate you so that all of a sudden their engagement isn't what it could or should be. Lastly, absences. That's something else to think about. You know, it's easy. This is something I would say I'm not great at, but it's easy to just be focused on the 25 in the room and not be thinking about the 5 who aren't there. And in the moment, those 25, they are your priority, but the 5 who aren't there, they're also your responsibility, and their education is in your hands. And if you're building over the course of the year, if they miss something here, while you might circulate back to it later, like, it's key. It's so key, in fact, that you're going to circulate again. So how are you providing the resources to help them be successful, and also to hold them accountable when they come back? Because lots of times it's just like, oh, well, I missed it, so I guess I don't have to do it. And that's not okay. That is not a part of being an engaged reader. All right, so after you think about the things that could kind of go awry, the next part is the actual instruction. When you are providing instruction, what are some strategies for keeping your readers engaged? So, education is cyclical. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with the gradual release model, but I cannot say enough about the gradual release model. And when you have access to these slides, if you click the link, it'll take you to a page with more information. But the gradual release is the most empowering form of instruction that I've come across in my 8 years. And it continues to be, a buzzword in education right now, at least. But it always will be. And that's because the gradual release, like I said, it empowers students, it builds up their stamina, it builds up their skill, and it builds up their confidence so that they know that they can do these things. So if you're not familiar with gradual release, stick with me here. And if you are, you can skip forward a little bit, but the gradual release, it starts out with students watching their teacher do these skills. So focused instruction, when it says I do it, that literally means I, the teacher, am doing this, and you're watching me, you're hearing me think through it. You know, part of planning, intentional planning, what mistakes are you going to intentionally make? You don't tell your kids that, but you intentionally make them so that they hear you have to think through different strategies for overcoming them. That's a part of planning. The next section of gradual release is the guided instruction. We do it as a class. Okay, so you just saw me do it. Now we're going to take the same skill and do it together as a group. The third step here is to do it like with a small group. So 2 or 3 maybe peers that they're working with. And then lastly is that independent learning where they're responsible for it on their own. One thing I will say with this is that before you can get to independent learning, you have to have provided your student with some level of feedback. Because if they're practicing this skill, but they're practicing it wrong, just because they did it in the you do it together, the collaborative learning portion, if they've done it incorrectly, they're not ready for the independent learning. But they're not going to know that unless you tell them. So we're going to get to this feedback idea as the last section of notes, but that's just something to think about, is you can't move to that last phase until you've provided your students with some feedback. So I've got a couple of examples here of how I use the gradual release model in my own classroom. Granted, not every day is a day for gradual release. It's great, it's successful when you can do it, but the expectation should not be that you're using gradual release every single day, because some days you just have to do research. Some days you just have to take this test. Some days, it just doesn't work out for every single skill, or every single day of your classroom, but each skill can be structured to follow this pattern. So this is an activity that my class does for at the beginning of the year when we're thinking about theme. Again, I'm constantly telling my 8th graders that the standard doesn't just say that you can identify theme, but it asks you how is it analyzed. But before you can analyze, you have to identify. So how do you identify theme? So you can see up here, we watched this little Pixar short called Boundin'. I love using these because the kids are all about it and they're quick. They're only like 5 minutes, and then you can get into the skill work here. So I would do this first section where it says I do. Then after I've gone through it once, we watch a second one. So it's not the same text, it's a second text. And we're looking for those same steps, but in a different text, or in this case, video clip. And then the last one, the independent practice, is this article story called Unusual Normality. So we've watched it a couple of times, or we've done the skill with these 2 videos, and now we're moving on to a text. So in my honors classes, lots of times I would skip that, that third section here, the collaborative learning. Or I would kind of mesh the guided instruction, collaborative learning at that pace. So you've just watched me do it, and maybe I'll let you kind of interact with me as I'm doing it. The second step, you and a partner are working through it. Then I give your feedback, and then you move to the last one where it's the independent learning. So this is an example for identifying theme. This one, it's another one where it's a little bit more writing focused and for thinking about essays. So you can see that first page is pretty much all the instruction portion, that first guided or focused instruction. I'm talking through these things, I'm defining terminology. And then on the back, the last 2 sections, different thesis statements, but the same skills. Can you write a topic sentence to go with this thesis statement for this paragraph? With a partner, that guided instruction. And then the last one, the batter up, that's when you're on your own. And they're trying to do it, show me that they can do it independently. So those are just, like I said, some examples of some things I've done in my classroom as far as instructional, as far as gradual release model goes. Another area of instruction that is huge is trying to engage the senses. A founding father of Johns Hopkins University, his name is escaping me right now. Oh, William Oster. William Oster said something along the lines about you need to use your senses to learn. You should be learning to see, you should learn to feel, you should learn to hear, you should learn to taste and to smell. In order to fully awaken your brain, so to speak. So the first area of tapping into this physical realm is to provide students a physical copy, a personal copy that they can use. I know different buildings have different policies about copying and all of that, but having something in their hand is so huge. And I know this isn't necessarily super popular in a digital age, but I would argue that you need to close the computers. If the text that you want to read is online, read it off to or print it off for them. Lots of times our online textbooks aren't super user friendly, and you spend so much time looking for the darn text that, or getting everybody on the right page, that you could have been so much further along if they just had the paper copy. But also it's something in their hands that they can connect with, those brain waves can connect with, the wiring in their brain. That's what I was trying to say. So personal copies, if you can avoid class sets, if it's a longer text and you print off a class set, have their notebook beside them so they're writing notes, and it's still engaging in a physical manner. If possible, next, get them moving, moving around the room, moving around the school, switching up the groups, whatever you can for our kinesthetic learners, getting their bodies engaged in that way. Now, with this one, definitely comes a classroom management piece that you might not be able to do this for every period or every group, or you might not be able to do it at the beginning of the year, but you build up the expectation by the end of the year. But if possible, get them moving while they are engaging with the academic content. Next, physical realm, thinking about colors and seeing things and them popping off the page to them, using colored paper for printing, highlighters, colored pencils, sticky notes, anything that they can mark up a text and really get it to pop off the page. Because when you're recalling in your mind images of things that you've just encountered, page after page after page of a novel looks exactly the same. But if you remember that page that had that big sticky note that you put on it, that just stands out a little bit differently. And that's what you want. You're trying to bring learning to life by engaging their senses. This last one, I kind of already touched on it, but whenever possible, paper and pencil, I genuinely believe is the way. And there's some science that shows, that our students, specifically those in middle and elementary grades, their brains just aren't able to organize all the tabs, they might have open. Plus, there's so many distractions online. But also the physical pressure of a pencil pushing on paper creates a different wiring in the brain than typing on a computer or reading on a computer screen. So if you can, even, there's so many online tools to annotate or highlight, whatever. It's not the same. That's good. That's better than nothing, but it's not the same as actually physically doing the process. So whenever possible, obviously sometimes you have to do research or you have to watch this video or whatever. But if possible, get your kids off their computers. Another part of this instruction, in order to engage learning, no opting out. Students like to look for ways to get out of something. We already talked about this, like, oh, darn it, I left my notebook in my locker, or it fell apart at home. Can you believe it? Whatever. Don't allow students the option to opt out. And that's, again, one of the beauties of the gradual release model. You've just empowered the students. They know what to do or they should know because they just watched you do it. They kind of interacted with the class as the class did it. And now it's time for you to do it. And something that's very important for us as educators, it's easy to be tired and to not want to fight it. And it doesn't have to be an angry, mean fight, but the expectation should be that your students are engaging with you and that they know they have to do this work. They know they have to show what they're learning. And if they don't do anything, they can't show you what they're learning or what they need help with. And so it's essential that we really hold students accountable for the work. One small example of opting out, even in reading, if a student is reading out loud, which, probably they've chosen to read out loud and to, we're not quite as much on forcing students to read out loud, but don't let them skip over a word. If they come to a word that they know, to opt out would be to skip over it, to not engage with it, to not put in the effort to figure out how to pronounce it or what it means. Don't allow students to do that. Use it as a teaching moment. Have them repeat the word back to you, look up the definition of the word, think about it in context of the sentence, whatever, but don't allow them to opt out. That's a small thing that happens, but it happens so often. And if you don't know a key word of a sentence, comprehension just tanks. It just takes a huge blow if you're not understanding what it is that you're reading. So that's a small example, but don't allow them to opt out. Another norm or expectation in your classroom, it's up to us to help our students see the intrinsic value of their learning. This should be a common conversation that helping them understand why it's so valuable, and what they can gain from doing this thing. Sometimes there's a place for just saying, well, you have to do it because you have to do it, and you might not understand why, but I'm asking you to trust me. But if we can, whenever we can, help our students see the value or understand the why behind what they're doing, that's huge in buy-in, in helping engagement. And we have to, at this point in their lives, oftentimes show them that value, but then they'll start to look for it themselves. Like, oh, I know how this will apply to my future life. And that kind of connects to this next one. Another part of being engaged is to know what the goal is for the day. What is the objective that you're trying to accomplish? Why are you trying to accomplish it? What are you going to do in order to accomplish it? How does this fit in with the big picture? Have your students know what is up with the classroom, or with the task, like why they're doing what they're doing. And then lastly, being organized. So kind of tied to that physical realm, learning how to organize yourself is a huge coming of age skill, and there's so many different ways to be organized that it's not a one size fits all, which is what makes it hard. But we have to show our students how to organize. They don't just naturally, most of them come with this organizational instinct and everything looks nice and neat and I know where to keep it and all of that. Being organized is a huge part of engagement. Why? Because if their folder is a mess and it's just exploding with all of these different papers from months ago or different classrooms, or it's crumpled up or it's in the bottom of the bag, whatever, all the minutes that you spend looking for these things is lost engagement in learning. All the different assignments that students start over on, they've lost what that original thought idea that they had to work with from the first time. And that's discouraging to them. And when someone gets discouraged, what happens? Engagement decreases. So we're looking for all these different avenues to keep our students engaged. One thing that I like to do in my classroom is have the students write down in their planner every single day, here's the objective for English class, and here's what I have to do about it. And I go through at the beginning of the year in particularly and sign or stamp or sticker their planners, and it definitely takes time, but eventually it becomes a habit. And then as the second and third quarters roll around, I just do random checks and reward those who are still keeping up with the habit. Lots of times in middle school, we assume our students are more grown than they actually are. And it's easy to say something and think, well, because I said it, they know it. Or because I said it, they must do it or they will do it. And that is not the case. We have to show them how to do even these simple things, like being organized, so that engagement doesn't die, because it's all about engagement in learning and staying or maximizing the time that we have with them. So moving on, the next and final thoughts about readers' engagement pertains to feedback. How do you give your students feedback on their progress? Because feedback is huge. So one way that I have started giving feedback that I did not do at the beginning of my career, but was pushed towards this by one of my administrators, and I can never ever go back, is through the use of proficiency scales. So a proficiency scale takes the standard provided by the state, and it breaks it down into a scale, a progression of how students are doing, with the end goal being not only being able to perform the standard, but mastering it, taking it to the next level. So you can see this is an example of when from 7th grade, a rubric or scale for the specific standard of writing a thesis statement. And what this does is it eliminates a lot of the subjectivity that tends to come with feedback or with grading. 5 points for being creative, 5 points for neatness, 5 points for this or that, or whatever. And it really just hones in on the skill. So the first benefit of a proficiency scale is that it can be objective. There's always subjectivity involved because one English teacher might write their scale differently than the next, but it does eliminate a lot of subjectivity. The next benefit is that these proficiency scales provide specific feedback, right? So if I'm trying to write this thesis statement and I got a 2, but not a 3, that's because you can see right here, I know exactly what I did wrong. I had a claim, but my thesis statement only alluded to one body paragraph, not 2. Oh, I know how to fix that for the next time, right? So a lot of creating the scale boils down to thinking about what is it that you want your students to be able to do and where do they commonly go awry. And so that's kind of the goal of the scale, is to provide specific feedback that's student friendly, right? It shouldn't be in such technical terms that you're struggling to even understand it. Students use these, you should pass these out as you pass out assignments and have students refer to them, have students score themselves, have students use these to help them create whatever it is that you're asking them to create. And that's a form of feedback. You're giving them feedback on the front end because they know what it is that they have to do in order to be successful with the skill. So a couple of other tips that or tips that a lot of people will say and tricks that I have learned in order to achieve that tip. Firstly, feedback is only valuable if it's timely. And this one I am preaching to the choir because I swear I am the slowest grader on earth. And so I've really had to work at this. So if I am trying to give feedback, we talked about earlier that your students really shouldn't move on to the independent practice section of gradual release until you've given them some feedback. In that moment, instead of just watching period after period after period, now I'm up to 6 periods worth of work that I have to grade in one night. No, as students are doing the work, I should be circulating, giving them pointers. A feedback doesn't have to be a grade. Feedback is just a pointer in conversation. And I might say, okay, write this down. This is what you need to fix for the next time. Then I haven't spent my time writing it because that takes forever to write feedback. But it's also in the moment, it's live. I can communicate it with the student. They can ask questions and I'm circulating as they're working. Circulation also helps with engagement, classroom management, keeping the kids accountable and on task as they're to be working, rather than you just sitting at your desk watching and hoping that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that's one trick for keeping your feedback timely. The next, keeping your feedback specific. So we already talked about the value of the rubrics. Use the rubrics, not just to grade the final assessment, but even to give them feedback, maybe as you're focusing on one skill. So I'm going to go back to this thesis statement. As my students are writing a thesis statement, this is the only thing I'm giving you feedback on. And it's hard, right? When there's a whole essay worth of areas of improvement, it's hard to just focus on one, but you will save yourself so much if you can just hone in on one specific skill, use the already created rubric and circle it. Say, this is what you would get today. What are you going to do to improve it for the next time? Something else, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a second. Develop like a classroom lingo of symbols. This one is actually, it's not mine, but it's from my 7th grade teacher. She gave us these at the beginning of the year so that if we saw, a question mark, we didn't have to ask her what her question was. It was just always, this is unclear. What do you mean by this? Can you elaborate? If she wrote CD, that meant we needed to add more concrete details. And it saved her a lot of time. And it also made us more engaged because we had to go back and look at the key and say, oh, in order to understand the feedback, I need to look at this, right? And that's taking a little bit more ownership of your learning than just saying, add more concrete details and moving it on from there. All right, so then that's an idea for specific skills, and it'll also save you a lot of time. And then lastly, your feedback should be meaningful. So the arbitrary good job or nice try or I liked this paragraph, that doesn't tell your students anything. It needs to be meaningful, and the feedback can be critical and still be kind. It can be critical because you're literally critiquing, but still helpful and not just shoot down any emotional positive energy that your students have. It should never do that. You should never be shooting down your students, because this is all about engagement, how to keep them engaged. So as they're, in their notebooks, I mentioned this earlier, this is a way for you to get your kids off their computers, to keep things organized, keep it all together in the physical realm. I go through and I have my students after, today you were supposed to be looking for the dialogue and the outsiders. Leave your notebook open, pile them on the back counter, put the feedback in here. Go through their actual learning process where they're trying it for the first time and give them meaningful feedback in a set place where they can use it later. It's just so helpful, and they look for it. They're constantly like, have you looked at my notebook yet? Because they want that feedback so that they can be more engaged, so that as they're engaged, they're not losing their time or wasting their time doing it incorrectly. So just a couple of final thoughts for you. I know this was a lot. We talked about culture of building a reading culture in your room and in your building, the intentional planning, how to take standards and break them down skill by skill, where to put them, how to create those activities that you want your students to do so that they're constantly engaged in what you're doing, how to have instruction that holds students accountable and keeps them engaged, and some techniques or philosophies to think about in regards to your instruction. And then also that feedback piece, how to provide feedback that is keeping your students engaged and moving them forward, right? Our job is always to be pushing our students forward towards the next phase of their education. So as you're going through these things, keep track. You're constantly, teaching is all about reflection. You're constantly tweaking. Keep track of your ideas for next time, for the next time you address that same skill, even not just next year. Give yourself feedback on what went well. Use formative assessments for each summative assessment. How would you do it differently? What went well? What did the kids seem to enjoy? You will thank yourself later. You really will, if you stay diligent at evaluating each unit as you go through it. That reflection piece is key. It really is key in order to be better, because in the same way that we're trying to help our students be better, we have to be better. We have to be better at keeping them engaged. We have to be better at keeping ourselves engaged and accountable for what it is that we're setting out to do. And so reflection is essential in that quest. And lastly, we're never going to be perfect, right? There's so many times when I'm like, dang it, even after 8 years, I still made that mistake. I can't believe I just did that. And even as a veteran, you will make rookie mistakes sometimes, and you just have to give yourself grace and try again and move on, because it's going to happen. The interruptions are going to come. Anything, you just can't foresee every possible thing that could possibly go wrong in a middle school or elementary or high school classroom. And so you just have to recognize that the goal isn't perfection. The goal is growth, not just for your students, but also for you. And being a part of this today is a part of you making that intentional effort to grow. So kudos to you for spending your time hearing me ramble on about different ways to keep students engaged. So as we kind of come to a close here, if you have questions, I would love to brainstorm with you about how to implement different tricks in your classroom. how to overcome certain challenges. If you have ideas of ways that you have strengthened the core in regards to reader engagement in your classroom, send them to me. My contact information is there on the right. I would love to hear from you, and continue the conversation, continue working, not just talking, but doing. I love that. Actually, let's do it. Let's create it. Let's get there. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but I am hoping to work more with Keep Indiana Learning, and looking towards thinking about writer engagement, how to get kids to write, because that's a beast. Whether it's breaking down standards, whether it's, there's just a million different areas of education that are exciting to me, but look out for those things. My Twitter is dismal, but I'm going to try to do better at posting on there as well. So in closing, I just thought I would leave you with a couple of thoughts that I find very challenging and encouraging. So this first one comes from Mortimer Adler, and he says, the purpose of learning is growth. And our minds, unlike our bodies, can continue growing as we continue to live. That's exciting, right? Learning is purposeful, and we're growing constantly. We're not decaying as our bodies are as we get older. There is hope for growth for our minds. So I love that. Next one, teaching is more than imparting knowledge. It's inspiring change. Learning is more than observing facts. It is acquiring understanding. If we can think about that as we come to our planning, our students will be more engaged. We're not just trying to impart wisdom upon them and help them learn facts from us. We want them to understand. We want them to be inspired. And if they are inspired and if they are understanding, they will in fact be more engaged. This next one is from Michelle Obama, and she says, the ability to read, write, and analyze, the confidence to stand up and demand justice and equality, the qualifications and connections to get your foot in the door and take your seat at the table. All of that starts with education. If that isn't exciting, I don't know what is. And if you look at that quote, she literally starts it with reading and writing. All of these things are the end result or the next result from reading and writing. Reading and writing is the springboard here. And that's exciting. And you get to be a part of that, and helping your students grow into these people who can stand up for good ideas, stand up for justice, stand up for each other, make connections, experience the world, provide their own ideas. All of that happens when our students are engaged in reading and writing. Lastly, the mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, and the great teacher inspires. This one I just love because it's true. Good teachers, they explain something, but have they shown it? They might have said it clearly, but showing it is on a whole other level. And if you can show it in a way that inspires our students, that is what makes someone great. That's the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher. And we're always striving for greatness, to be as great as we possibly can, not just for ourselves, but for the good of our students. And so that kind of brings me back to that question that I started with, thinking about what inspires you when it comes to the written language. What inspires you about teaching, reading, and writing? How can you be passionate in your own classroom about even something like reading and writing skills? Because again, if you are passionate, that's going to spark something in your students. It really will. And it'll spark a little flame of engagement that if you can keep adding, fuel to the fire, oxygen to the fire, it's going to grow. It's going to grow, and you're going to be a great teacher. And it's exciting, right? That's so purposeful in our lives, is to actually be achieving the purpose that we are called to. So thank you for your time. Again, if you've got questions or ideas, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to working with you in the future.